We have a really special panel lined up for you now. We're going to talk about women and leadership and what makes for great leadership, and are women better leaders? I think it's a fantastic topic. It's one that I discuss with my wife quite a bit. She's also quite involved in this. She's helped me cheat and prep for this a tiny bit, so I hope our panelists aren't too overwhelmed. But one thing that I found was, this is great, right? There are more CEOs named Thomas, there's 7 of them, than CEOs who are named women, than CEOs that are women, 3. In all of Germany's 160 traded, publicly traded companies. Do you get that? There are more people named Thomas than there are women in the 160 publicly traded companies in Germany. This is from 2017, so maybe a couple of the old Thomases have passed on, or maybe we have a couple of Tomasitas that have come in, but more or less it's shit, right? And it really, it doesn't take long and many statistics to look at to understand the status quo and the situation. The question is, what do we do about it? And to discuss that, and to discuss the potential, and to answer the question, are women better leaders? We have 3 great people. Sangbreeta, Moitra, a global strategist and speaker, will join us. Heydt, who literally teaches experience design at the Kennedy Space Center. So the customer journeys of traveling into space, I'm astounded. We need to have drinks and discuss this outside of this one, because I think that's absolutely fantastic. And Jean-Paul Rollert, who's teaches leadership and ethics at Harvard. So no lack of talent to discuss this talk. I'd like to invite the 3 of you up to the stage. Please, a nice warm round of applause. So, okay.
Whoa.
So in true 15-second style, I've asked our panel to take 15 seconds to introduce themselves and to help us understand why they're motivated to be here with us today. And since you're on my right and the closest, why don't you go first?
Hi, I'm Sangbreeta Moitra. It's like sangria with a B and a T. What I do, I hack human behavior. How I do it, I combine my passion for neurobehavioral science, communication, change, and people transformation. And why I'm here today? Because I believe it's extremely important for women to be seated and lead the tables where decisions are made. Thank you.
Awesome.
As George indicated, my name is John-Paul Rollert. I teach classes in leadership, ethics, and politics at Harvard University and the University of Chicago. In the classes that I teach, I have a really interesting vantage point on leadership insofar as all of my students are young leaders. So I have a sense of maybe what's coming tomorrow. And to the degree I think these issues are important and pertinent, I think it's also important to hear the voices of men on these matters and not just women. Sometimes we tend to back off from these issues and cede the ground, but I think that that tends to trivialize them. So hopefully I can get a chance to engage and share my own views.
That's great. Welcome.
Hello, I'm Sandy Heydt. I am the Chief Marketing Officer, and I do lead the customer journey experiences as well as sales, marketing, and branding for a company called Space Perspective. And we are located at Kennedy Space Center, and we will be taking people to space in late 2024. And the reason why I'm very passionate about this is my initial training was as a psychologist before I got into leadership and management in business. And so I see this kind of from a couple different angles, the psychology point of view and the management piece. So I'm excited to chat.
So don't do this now, but at some point, do check out our website. I did that last night as I was prepping for this thing, and the capsules look very cool. The waiting list is long, so get in line now.
If you want to hear more about it, I'm speaking at Cosmoton at 6:40.
Ah, very cool. Oh, very nice. So I'd like this to be as interactive as possible. If you all have anything to add, to negate, to support, or just to question, please put your hand up, and as I can weave it in, I'll take your questions throughout instead of saving everything to the end. I think that might make things a little bit more interactive. So please, they'll still have some time at the end for a formal Q&A, but do feel free to chime in. This is a good room and a nice time to be able to do that. So that said, I did prep a couple of things, and want to kick off with an overall question, because the idea of leadership can be relatively fluid in its understanding. And I thought one of the easiest ways for us to lead ourselves into this dialogue would simply be to ask the question, what skills, talents, and points of view are required to be a great leader? In other words, what makes this happen, regardless of what sex you are, regardless of what gender or identification? What makes for great leaders? Sandy, why don't you start? I'll go from the other side this time. And if you need a little bit of time to think, that's just fine.
Well,
too.
no, I have a list already in my mind. I think that regardless of your gender, a good leader shows empathy, true empathy, compassion, is patient in dealing with their team, and is willing to be vulnerable. Because I believe that if you show your humanity to your team, you will get more humanity in return. So that's, in a nutshell, what I think is necessary. Some humility really works as well.
Thank you.
So, not to be a bit redundant, but I actually think that quality of empathy is really very important. It's something that we don't emphasize enough, especially in a world where so much global business is going on, so you're constantly crossing kind of cultural boundary lines. But also, I think in a world where we are more eager to make sure that there are more people with different experiences at the table. And what that means is that you have to slow down and be more attentive to those who are around you and use that capacity for empathy that I think we too often take for granted. Look, if everyone at the table looks like you and thinks like you don't have to have that capacity for empathy because you can achieve groupthink. But I think we all recognize why in the modern world that's not only not a particularly efficacious way of going about things, it's not a particularly ethical way either. So I'd love to underscore that quality of empathy.
I've thought long and hard about this subject for quite a while. And if I had to say it in a nutshell, I think true leadership is when the person in power or people in power care more about their people than power. To me, that's the definition of true leadership. And oftentimes we see it happen in a very public domain that our leaders in power don't care enough about people as they do for power.
Like that.
Can we build on that a little bit more? Help me understand how we can identify empathy in the workplace from a leadership perspective. Are there some specific examples or something that either in a specific company or a specific situation that any of you could point to help me understand or help us understand how empathy is demonstrated as a leadership characteristic or talent?
May I give an example?
Please.
Because this happened to one of my closest friends. She's one of the youngest people to be promoted as partner in the advisory firm that she works in. And now she's also one of the first people to be promoted to the next level of the partner path. But when she was first being interviewed to be promoted into a partner role, the assessments, sorry, not questions, you have to go through rigorous assessments. And there were many situations which were role plays, like there are your colleagues basically in a dogfight. How do you resolve it? And she had a very humane way to resolve it that would be a win-win situation and people would go back to their job. And the feedback that she got from the psychometric analysts or the experts hired were, this is not the way we do it. You're being way too empathetic, because essentially what they want you to do is tell them, like you would mother a child, like, shut up, shake hands, go do your work. Mm. That's not how it functions in a workplace. And she she debated back with them saying, this is my kind of leadership, and I believe it's high time that you make space for how you define leadership to me. In this company and to your clients and your stakeholders. I represent empathetic, inspirational leadership. Do you have place in your company for that? And because she was also one of the first people to actually speak up when She wasn't representing the classic alpha leadership that she did get promoted and she got her position, but she really had to fight back for that. To me, that's a classic example of how empathy, how important it is and how easily it's overlooked in organizations even today.
It's great. Anybody else?
Go ahead, and then I have a little.
Please.
I have a little trick after you.
Oh, okay. Well, I just wanted to highlight one thing as someone who spends a lot of time thinking about empathy in an academic context, in a teaching context, is that, you know, to be an empathetic person takes a tremendous amount of patience. And I tend to think that in leadership settings, patience is the most undervalued virtue, right? We tend to overlook it very quickly. But when you're managing people, I mean, people are tremendously frustrating to deal with. We make mistakes, we don't get things as quickly as we'd like. We have different ways of doing things. And of course, if you're in a leadership position, you're constantly overstretched to begin with. And if you don't practice that patience, not only are you going to have a difficult time managing people and connecting with them, it's going to be impossible actually to understand them, right? To take their individuality seriously. And so I think that, you know, when you're embracing empathy as a virtue of leadership, it goes hand in hand with patience, and it becomes a very different way of engaging people. And insofar as we all know, when you're in a leadership position, you're setting a standard for people around you. You're communicating that if patience is good enough for me as a leader, it's certainly good enough for everyone, and it dictates a way that we must engage one another. So just wanted to underscore that value of patience, which I think we can often tend to brush off, but is a really important virtue.
That's great. Thank you. Sandy, you said you had a trick?
And, yeah, and it is, because, you know, when you really do care deeply about somebody else's experience, you can't rush it. So when you are talking to them and asking them about how they feel or something that you've noticed, you have to give them time to answer. You know, we're all in a rush and we're like, oh my gosh, they're going on. You know, they can tell, right, if you don't mean it. So I was trained by somebody in neuro-linguistic programming. I don't know if any of you know about that. But it was a beautiful training. So empathy is, you know, walking in another person's shoes. So you basically have two circles. And you stand in one, and the person that you're managing or that you're having an issue with is you pretend that they're there. And you stand there and you tell that person how you're feeling and maybe why you're frustrated or what you want from them or whatever. And when you're finished, you move over to the other circle and you look back at you. And then you speak back to you as that person. There is something about standing in that circle where they were and looking at you and coming back with how you feel. Then you move back to your circle and you speak to them again. And there is something about that movement that is really cool and works for me every time.
Thank you. It's really good. I mean, you think about the stereotypes of great leaders that you see in the media or even in the marketplace today, and the comparison and the lines that you're drawing between what's optimal and ideal and what we see on a regular basis is dramatic. It really is. It's an amazing thing, and we'll get to it because there's actually some good statistics that back up why it's a good idea. It's not just bullshit that thinks, oh, we should all be nicer together, or we should all be more empathetic, but actually there's some actual numbers that help support the idea of why this actually works. But I'll save that for a minute. I'd like to ask about biology, actually, or genetics, or social aspect, and ask, are men and women socialized and raised differently so that those skills and talents and points of view are more inherently and more comfortable and natural for one gender as opposed to another? Are we trained that way? Is this genetic? Is it social? Or is it bullshit? Jean-Paul, why don't you go first? Now you were nodding along. So.
Well, I think that certainly from a perspective of socialization, so I've taught now, to go back into my mind, for about a little over 15 years. And I've noticed a real change in my time in the way in which kind of the men and women in my classes view matters of leadership. And what I tend to find is that the women who are in my classes are much more ambitious about taking on the responsibilities of leadership than they once were. And what I think that reflects is something very good in society, that we're becoming more inclusive, that we're encouraging all people to kind of put themselves forward. But it's not just that. It's not just what I see, the young women doing. I think young men have a better sense that they need to find ways to accommodate different leadership styles, to listen more. There's a lot to be pessimistic about perhaps in the world around us, but at least as I see in my students with respect to this question, different kind of cultural dispositions and social dispositions, which I think are healthier and certainly give good reason for optimism just in kind of this 15 years I've been teaching. So I think insofar as there are these social elements, they're evolving in ways that certainly give me good reasons for hope.
The data backs him up, by the way, his own from, not yours, but from Harvard.
That's good.
I found a cool chart, which you can come by and see later. I'll spam you on WhatsApp or whatever. But it basically shows that it takes women until they're 40 years old to cross the same line of confidence in rating themselves as men, on average. And this is data on 3,876 men and 4,077 women since 2016, show that women's gains in confidence are more than 3 times that of men, but only because of the massive gap that they have earlier in their careers. We stunt ourselves and our daughters and women early, and they have to make up for it at speed once they turn 40. For whatever reason it might be. So yeah, okay, it looks great once you get older, but in those early phases, as you said, it's quite difficult, but potentially improving. Yes, no? Bullshit?
No, it makes me angry.
It makes you angry. Yeah, it does. I have 2 daughters, I'm very angry.
And this isn't really maybe I'm going to take us down a different path here, but
Please.
We were talking about it earlier. I think it's about power. And I think it's about the people in power that want to keep it. And so whoever is not in power has to fight even harder, whether you are a person of color, a woman, or whatever it is in any given situation. I do find that a lot of leaders are not generous in giving up power and in letting others grow and letting them shine, because some reason they feel that will diminish them, which is not the case. But that's an issue that I have seen a lot of, holding on to power.
So there's some, for those of you who don't know, I come from Amsterdam. So you can see the perfect representative of a tall Dutch person. No, I call them walking skyscrapers. But there's something that we talk about a lot in my network, and that is shameless self-promotion. Because here's something that I come from India originally. I'm Indian, and now I'm a Dutchie. So one thing that I've noticed is so similar across cultures, across all kinds of barriers, is the narrative for women, what defines a good woman. And oftentimes I've seen a good woman, a virtuous woman, is one who doesn't show off. She doesn't talk about herself. She lets her sacrificial work talk about herself. Even if we look at if I think of the movies and media, that's how women are portrayed. The good ones, they don't promote, because a good woman doesn't promote herself. So we started this narrative on shameless self-promotion, because if you don't blow your own trumpet, no one else is going to do it for you. And earlier today, Sandy and I were talking about the hunter and gatherer, where traditionally, where women tend to be the gatherers now, and that's something that's needed, and men used to be the hunters. But I think it's also important for us women to be the hunters, to be the ones who speak up for ourselves, dare to step up, stand up, speak up. And because this is how we get the value, the time, the attention that we deserve, so rightly deserve.
I think
so that's something I love to think about. Let's shamelessly promote ourselves. And if we do get connected on LinkedIn or Instagram, I would love to see you push for yourself and speak up about what makes you so amazing.
But we aren't socialized to do that as women, as girls, mostly. And men are socialized to do that. So I think there's a lot in how we are raised.
So McKinsey published some data talking about the business case for inclusion and diversity, I&D, and saying that it's stronger than ever. The relationship between diversity in executive teams and the likelihood of financial outperformance has strengthened over time. Right? The findings emerged from their latest data set. This is less than 2 years old, encompassing 15 countries and 1,000 large companies. Right? And I'm cheating here because I have a sentence now I'm going to use from my wife, who's a coach and trainer in diversity, so she's helping me out in the background. Thank you, Katya. And she said, the question is good, of course, and the answer is that the metrics actually point to this, the metrics that we just discussed. So the real question is around why don't women get to lead? Or maybe into the current system, why CEOs and managers who run every other aspect of their business based on KPIs turn a blind eye to this, to the financial impact and the performance improvement that diversity in the workplace brings. How do you change that? I don't think we need to discuss the validity of that point because Harvard, McKinsey, Accenture, they all talk about it. It's right there on the table. How do you change that? And I think power plays a role, as you said, but if this is money on the table, KPIs that are being ignored, then how do you make that change happen?
Okay. Whether it's diversity in an organization or even a country that fights back for freedom, the one thing I've noticed is it's always the common man that pushes for change. And I think the reason why diversity is being so talked about with all the movements that are happening across the world, it's because people like you and I are done with seeing inequality, whether it's in your prominence or position in an organization, or you're seeing injustice in organizations. Because oftentimes leadership, they just talk the talk, they don't walk the talk. So I think it's because of the scrutiny and also the impact of social media. Now we tag, we hashtag, we do things, and you can't escape that. Companies can't block it out anymore. So I think there's so much good that's being done by the common man, woman, person that's creating meaningful change. And I think that's the way to go, because now they can't escape but face the facts and also be answerable. We're talking about diversity. I mean, there was this big firm that did this diversity PR thing on all across social media, and basically they didn't realize that they copy-pasted the same person on 3 rows. A man from Africa, they just copy-pasted his face in the diversity campaign in 3 different rows of their entire diversity profile. So that also happens, and now they have to be accountable for that. Yeah.
Anyone else?
One thing I would note, and I think there's a fascinating tension at play, is that on the one hand, there are kind of remarkable changes afoot. Let me give you one from my own personal life. So my father in the United States graduated from law school in 1967. There were 5 women. He went to Georgetown University's law school. There were 5 women in his graduating class. 40 years later, almost 40 years later, when I went to law school at Yale Law School, for the first time, there were more women than men in a law school class. So change is happening, and if you have that historical vantage point, it's profound, the changes that are going on. I do think the change goes on in part because people make those demands, and I think part of the frustration that we often feel is change is not happening faster. And so it's this kind of tense play that we're on. The one hand, you have to acknowledge the extraordinary changes that are going on, because it certainly makes me feel good when I see those changes. But on the other hand, in the moment, you have to keep pushing and agitating, right? The battle is not over, so to speak. But whenever I have students who feel a little bit disheartened, and I think often have good reason for feeling disheartened, I say, well, just go talk to your parents and your aunts and uncles and ask them a little bit about what their experience was 30 or 40 years ago. And that's not to say you should feel complacent, but it will give you a sense of how these changes are happening. And as someone who has now, say, been in the academy for about 15 years, even just the changes from when I was in college and law school to the changes to what I see now in terms of the people who are staffing senior positions, leadership roles within the academy. Even within that 15 years, those changes are profound. But they haven't happened because of some kind of natural law. It's not inevitable, but it comes about because people are advocating for that change and asking for it, and they should continue to do so.
Sandy, would you like to add anything to this?
Well, I still think it's not fast enough. I mean, we still have all those Thomases.
Yeah.
So I think we have to keep agitating.
Are there any Thomases here? We apologize
Sorry,
for using your name, but hey, it is what it is.
Yeah, I'd like to see the younger generation really get on it and not put up with it and stick together and support each other. I think that, from a perspective of being a woman, lift each other up, support each other, make each other better. That's what the guys do.
It's good. I'd like to discuss a topic called the broken rung, something I've been reading about lately. I'm not sure if you're aware of this. The broken rung, a rung is in a ladder, one of the steps in a ladder. I'm not sure, wie sagt man das auf Deutsch? Ein Rung? So, jetzt verstanden, was das ist, das broken rung. Yeah? So the broken rung theorizes that one of the main obstacles for women in achieving senior leadership positions is the first one, is the first rung, is the first step is unavailable to them. It's not about the glass ceiling because this is way up. This is at the upper echelons of senior management. But this idea of even getting on the ladder is a significant challenge. It says, a phenomenon in which the biggest obstacle women face on the path to senior leadership is at the first step up to manager. For every 100 men who were promoted to a first-time manager position, researchers found that only 72 women received a similar promotion. Doesn't sound like a lot. You could probably debate it over a beer. Yeah, 72 to 100, it's pretty close. But in the end of the day, statistics are statistics, and that's a fuckload of people that we're talking about when you look over time. Is this true? Have you lived this yourself? Do you have an example of this that you could share with us? Or do any of you have an example that you could share that typifies that idea? Is it real?
It's very real.
Speaking to the mic.
Oh, right. That was my brain, talking before my mouth. It's very real. I will give a bit of a different answer, actually, taking you off on a tangent. But I found a lot of considerable success in the corporate career that I had. I resigned when I was global manager to start my entrepreneurship. That was 2018. But until then, it worked out for me because number one was, and I'm talking aside from the skills that were skilled already, was to build allies before decisions were being made. So I realized, and this was because my mentors advised me, that Sangbreeta, build your allies, strategic allies within your organization, who you talk to before those meetings happen, before you sit at the table. So they already know that you have something to say, and they know to call you out in a positive way, to ask you to share your opinion. So that helped me a lot. Because my mentor, what she faced was, she was in a shipping firm, the only female in the board, and she was in charge of the Baltic shipping route and stuff. And she would go into meetings in China and Russia right straight out of the flight. Maybe her shirt was crinkled a bit, and she would walk straight in, and the people on the table would say, "Yeah, could you get us some coffee, please?" Not knowing that she was one of them. So, she's faced that kind of judgment where people who don't know her assume that, oh, you're the woman here. Clearly, you're here to take notes or bring us coffee. And it's because of her advice today that, or when I started my management career, that I was able to prevent that with the feedback she gave on building allies with the right people in the organization and them sponsoring you. Yeah,
it's good.
Okay.
Yeah, one thing I can say from the perspective of a business school is that I think that on the one hand, there's a lot more emphasis that is put out to kind of create the kinds of opportunities that Sangbreeta is kind of describing, which is how, as a woman, can you find a way to put yourself forward, to make yourself known, and so forth. I do think there's somewhat of an interesting tension in that. I think I often encourage my students, you have to kind of carve out your own vision of leadership, right? Don't feel as though you have to do precisely what you see before you. But there is obviously a kind of push and pull dynamic there, and to the degree that you are dealing with people, in an executive situation who kind of acknowledge that sense of aggressiveness, you probably have to play by their rules. But to the degree you gain your own power, maybe you should open the rule book up for more approaches. Because otherwise, then we all have to kind of take on, at times, some of the worst excesses of type A alpha male folks, and I'm not entirely convinced that's the way to go. Sometimes you do have to make a virtue of necessity and do it anyway, because the people who hold the power, that's the only way they'll recognize it. But my hope is that to the degree that our executive ranks reflect the diversity of the people who are coming in, that you won't have to make a necessity of it, and we'll find new ways to kind of exercise leadership that ultimately are more inclusive. But for now, I think you understandably do have to do that.
Any questions or feedback from the audience at the moment? Please. Speak up.
Sorry, thank you very much for this. I was wondering if women have more obstacles to go up in their career. So, and if they manage, apparently they might have more passions we're talking about. Does the situation make them better leaders when it comes to empathy, or on the contrary, they will, make the way of other women going up and going after them harsher, because they would say, oh, I manage, so you will manage as well. What is your opinion on that?
Glad I don't have to answer it.
Sorry, just in case I'm not understanding you clearly, do you mean that once a woman has walked the path, she will support other women too, or that she will suppress?
Exactly. I mean, those solutions, either or, what would you say? Because would it make her a better leader? Or on the contrary, she would say, oh, it was so harsh to me, so I want to make the way easier for you as a father generation,
That depends on the person, isn't it? It's about what was it Viktor Frankl who said, between action and reaction lies your freedom of choice. So yeah, I've seen both kinds of people, and in fact, last week I was at a corporate pharma event in the Netherlands, and there was a panel on leadership, and one lady, which I think was so brave of her, she shared, and I think maybe, do you know about the queen bee syndrome? Can anyone raise their hand if they don't know about it? Which is great, then I get to share it with you. Queen bee syndrome is one where happens exclusively, it's seen in the queen bees in nature, but also you see this happen in human females. Well, what happens is once you reach a certain position, and you often mark your nemesis, your threat, as another woman in doing the same job than you would a man doing the same job, because somewhere you identify, this woman will take away my identity and everything that I've fought for so hard for. Now I'm not going to be that special one anymore. Now, coming back to the example and anecdote that I was sharing with you, this woman, C-suite executive in the Netherlands in the pharma industry, shared that she was the only woman on the board for a very long time, and she actively did not want other women on the board, because she said, I was the only woman, and these men used to fear me because I'm the one thing that's keeping their diversity and inclusion together. Otherwise, they would be a PR nightmare. But now if another woman comes in, then I'm just another woman. Nobody's going to listen to me anymore. All the change that I'm making happen is going to disappear. The fact that she admitted shows that she's on the path of evolution. But then you also have women like my mentor, who actively goes out of her way to support me, to say, Sangbreeta, do this, do that. Here are some tips and feedback how you can improve. And when I asked her, you've done so much for me, Iana. How can I pay you back? What can I do for you? And she said, just promise me that you'll do for another woman what I did for you. Mm.
One way I think also maybe of answering that question, because I do think this is a real problem, and it's something that I've seen in my own life. there's a saying in the United States that is often applied to politics, which is personnel is policy, right? And so if you're dealing with a situation like that, which Sangbreeta just described, where you are the one exception, right? Unfortunately, the token in some respects, you want to hold that position because that's your power. Mm. It's a very different matter if there are lots of people like you at the table, right? I have nothing but sympathy for someone who has to kind of break that ice or break that glass ceiling. That's very, very difficult. But I do think a little bit of the responsibility, at least, you know, in the worlds we share, has changed a little bit. You know, most boards have at least one person. Well, how do you get half of the board like that? How do you fill those executive ranks? And I think if you do that, and I think this is where a lot of companies and a lot of organizations, because they recognize this is a problem, but they figure they've got one seat at the table set aside, the more that you aggressively work to bring more people in, the less this becomes a concern, right? But until that point, I think what you're describing is something that we need to be on the watch for. I know one person, very close friend of my family, and I saw this as she went through her professional life, exactly this kind of behavior, but she was the one exception. Mm-hmm. And that was remarkable in the 80s and early 90s. Any board that is in a position like that or any place of power where there's still just one seat is not doing nearly enough. And that's where you really have to kind of push forward, especially from below, and just say that's unacceptable. And I do see that with the students that I have. You know, these are people who are in their early, mid-20s. They will be very clear it's unacceptable. And that, frankly, it's a lot easier when you don't have to be the single person raising your voice, but it's part of a chorus.
And I have, to your question, I've seen both. And but in a way, you know, I'll be vulnerable with you for a minute. I have been in many situations the only woman in the room. And I can tell you, it actually feels good. Okay? It feels good. It's like, it feels like, you know, a lot of times the men will ask you more questions, and sometimes they do hang on your every word, maybe because you look like some kind of an animal they didn't expect to see in the room. But you do, if you don't watch yourself in a position of control and power, anybody can get sucked into it. And so I think that it's really important as we train our leaders that we look at this point about power and control and ego, and we make sure that we test for it, or we help train people to understand that this is not going to serve them well, not only in business, but in their life in general.
Bravo. Let's shift a little bit. I'd like to talk a little bit more about, or ask you more about what the future brings, and a little bit about skills that might be needed. And I'll posit a statement. It's not, I'm not saying it's correct or not. It's just more for our debate. That women don't want to be promoted because they're women, but because they can because they can do the job and have the skills that it takes. Right? So they're not looking for a handout because you're a woman. It's more like, no, I can do this. I just need the opportunity. And the question is, so first question is, do you feel that's the right? Is that right? Is there some truth to that? And then the question is then, if that's true, then what are businesses doing to be more transparent in terms of data intelligence or in terms of skills that they need to manage for the future? What are they doing to cast their net as wide as possible to then meet the needs from the skills that they've identified, especially when that becomes something that has a implication for a more diverse group of people working for the company? It's a long-winded question. You want me to break it back up? So the first question is, do women want to be promoted? The posit is, do women want to be promoted not because they're just women, but because actually they can get the job done? And if that's the case, then what are companies doing to identify the gaps that they have, to identify the skills that they need that women can actually do better? Is that happening? Is it being ignored? Is it being shoved under the table? Are there examples that you have of companies that are actually doing this? Instead of speaking in the kind of maybe it would be great if, are there companies that are actively doing this kind of thing now?
Well, maybe So we live in a world where I think we broadly embrace meritocracy. And all of us want to believe that we have gotten the good things in this life because we justly deserve them, right? So no one wants to think, oh, I've been handed this opportunity purely because, say, I'm a woman or I represent, a certain preferred group.
Exactly.
That is absolutely true. On the other hand, what I would say is let's not split hairs. After this idea that personnel is policy, let's get as many people as we can and worry about some of these finer questions of meritocracy later, in part because the way in which decisions are made are reflective of the people making them. And until you have boardrooms and environs of power that reflect that diversity, we might get hung up on some of these questions. Well, is this meritocracy or is this tokenism? Let's figure that all out later. Let's get the diversity now, right? Let's make sure that kind of the way in which decisions are made reflect the diversity we long for, and then we can worry about those problems later, because let's be very clear. 50 years ago, when all the decisions were made by people who look like me around the board table, they didn't worry about that.
Your hair is too long for them to look like
That's
you.
right, exactly, right.
That's okay.
That's right, a little less hair. But those are not things that they worried about. Let's get the diversity, right? And then we'll sort out some of those problems later.
This is getting personal, like I'm sharing a personal story, and I know that this is such an important point that it doesn't matter as long as we're getting our foot through the door. But you know what I observed about 2 years ago, how much it stung my ego. So when I was when I was called as a token, and I know that it's okay, it doesn't matter, it's for the greater good, but dang, it stings. So I was at this teleco event where it was a select group of business, professionals and very important people coming together, discussing future of work, and I was there too. Now, I don't live my life thinking I am a woman of color in a white country. No, I'm just being myself, and so are other people. And then there were selected, like just there were three people, three women in the room of about 250. And as I got talking to one of the women, she said, oh, we met each other. We said, oh, how wonderful to find each other here. And she said, oh, yeah, of course you were invited, women of color, check, check. And that hurt. But she didn't say it in a bad way. Here's the thing. She's a genuinely good person. I knew there was no malicious intent there. Yeah. For all reasons, she thought Sangbreeta deserves to be there because of XYZ reason, but it really hurt my ego. So, and I don't blame her for it. So I think when you're hearing these things, and I think I see a lot of people who are, young, on the path to great leadership and being fantastic in what you do, you're going to hear this sometimes, and it's going to hurt, especially when you think you rock, and that you're being invited to places because you are great at what you do and not because of your appearance. And I would say in those moments, just swallow the ego however much it hurts, because one day people will see your value. Yeah.
So I have a question for you.
For me?
Well, for somebody.
That's not
because isn't, in the old days, it was affirmative action. And then affirmative action went out of vogue because it was, people were against it, and it wasn't fair, all of these things. And now do we call the same thing diversity? Like big companies have diversity departments and diversity officers and whatever, and everybody's trying to make, the companies look different. But isn't that affirmative action, and isn't whatever you want to call it necessary? And so let's just say you have a position open and everybody is equal, let's say, and then you pick the woman because she's a woman. And there's so much backlash about that. Or let's say it was your child who couldn't get into Harvard because somebody else's child was a minority and they got in that person's place, but your child had the same grades. It becomes mushy. And it also becomes a situation where the people, again, with the power, maybe want to talk a good game, but when it specifically impacts them, then they don't want to go down that road. And I just think it gets really messy at that point, and maybe that's one reason why we're not seeing the change as quickly as we should.
I think it's possible. I think it's very. I think messy is a good word for it. But I think it's been a fucking disaster up until now, and so I'm happy with messy. Give me messy. I'll take messy. I'll take messy over the last 50 to 100 years any day. No problem. Are women better at managing in crisis? Harvard says yes. Harvard 2020 Business Review points to Merkel and to Jacinda Ardern and says that during the COVID crisis that actually these two women leaders did a far better job in managing the crisis in their own country than in a lot of other places around the world. They pointed to other examples other than those two particular leaders and posited the case that women manage better in a crisis. Is that true?
You know, at the risk of generalization, although the question does invite generalizing,
Yeah.
I will speak from my experience in my own classes that so many of the young men in my classes feel as though demonstrating strength and prowess and superiority is so important that they find their way into doing stupid things quite frequently, right? They don't show the kind of reserve and patience and judicious reticence that sometimes you should exercise when you're making decisions. And to the degree that the young women who are in my classes are different, they're just more thoughtful, more careful, more prudent, more patient. I don't know how much that is just simple matters of biology as opposed to kind of socialization, but what I can see is that particularly in moments of crisis when you know, a lot of, again, the young men in my classes feel like it's a time to beat their chests even louder. It's the kind of women who are taking a step back to assess things. And certainly the kinds of examples you've given someone like a Jacinda Ardern is a wonderful, I think, example of that. There's good reason, this is again why I think there are certain dangers in trying to narrow what leadership looks like. And I think one of the benefits of having so many new people in positions of power is it's giving us different ways to think about leadership. And that to me is vital and necessary. Necessary now and increasingly necessary in a world where diversity will only grow. And thank goodness for that.
15-second answers, and then we need to wrap it up. Or 15 seconds of closure, if you'd like.
Oh, I'm thinking about I was so enthralled by what you were saying,
Yeah,
I
it's
wanted
good,
to
right?
clap.
Yeah.
Really. Sangbreeta and I were talking about this earlier. Neither of us wants to say men or women are better at something, because it really is the individual person. I don't mean to speak for you, but we were agreeing on that. And because I don't like to be put in a box, I try hard not to put somebody else in a box. I just think that a lot of the ways that men are socialized sometimes make it difficult for them to be the kind of empathetic, compassionate, and patient leader that's necessary. And women, I think, sort of have a head start at that because of how we're brought up. That's my 15 seconds.
Thank you. Greta?
I would say for the women who are biologically experiencing, okay, can I be just open and, yeah? Okay, for example, there was a journalist who had to go into a war zone during her periods, and she had a particularly painful one. And if she didn't do that coverage, she would lose the spot that she fought for so hard. So somehow she managed to pop some painkillers, change her sanitary products behind some bunker, and continue filming. And even if you think about the workplace, so often you're in pain, or how many of you are mothers here? Can you raise your hands? Oh my God, hats off to you. How do you manage that, make it happen? So I think in terms of that also, I'm not talking about all women, but the ones who, you're managing this personal situation and still pushing for a professional, your professional presence, and that takes a lot of guts. And to end this with a quote that I once heard in Australia, never mess with an animal that bleeds for 7 days and does not die.